Okay, well, as Jeremy said, we are going to finish up Ezra this week. We only have one question and then the outline, and we'll begin Nehemiah. But if you remember, when Ezra decided to come back to Jerusalem, we see that, if you remember, he arrived safely in Jerusalem and had no sooner unpacked, and some of the elders in Israel approached him. If you look back in Ezra chapter 9, Ezra chapter 9. Now this is yes, Ezra 9. Now he's come back to Jerusalem, kind of settled in, and we see in verse 1, now when these things had been completed, the princesses approached me, saying, these are the leaders now in Israel. They're coming to Ezra here with some news. And they tell Ezra, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands, according to their abominations, those of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, and the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy race has intermingled with the peoples of the lands. Indeed, the hands of the princes and the rulers have been foremost in this unfaithfulness. When I heard about this matter, this is Ezra now speaking, when I heard about this matter, I tore my garment and my robe, and pulled some of the hair from my head and my beard, and sat down appalled. Then everyone who trembled at the words of the God of Israel on account of the unfaithfulness of the exiles gathered to me, and I sat appalled until the evening offering. Ezra's heard some pretty bad news here, hasn't he? And why would Ezra have been so astonished at what he heard about even the Levites and the priests marrying these foreign wives? If you turn back quickly just to Exodus 34, we read something that was commanded to Israel a long time ago. Exodus 34 and 16. Jeremy, do you want to read that, please?
Take you of your daughters unto thy sons, and their daughters. Sorry, let's try it. And thou take of their daughters unto thy sons, and their daughters go a whoring after their gods, and make thy sons go a whoring after their gods. Thou shalt make thee no molten gods. I guess that's sort of taking the verse that's in the middle of the sentence, but
it is. Yeah, I could have picked a better verse. But the thought there too, though, is just of the unfaithfulness of the fathers taking daughters, husbands taking daughters, and causing their sons. The other verse I had was Deuteronomy 7 and 16. Deuteronomy 7 and 16. Gord, do you want to read that, please?
might be 6.
Might be 6.
You have 1 to 6 on that slide up there.
Oh, sorry. Yes, right. I left the dash there. 1 to 6. Maybe read a couple verses each, Gord, and then call it.
When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, 7 nations more numbering and mightier than yourselves. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them.
Furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them, You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will quickly destroy you.
Okay, according to these verses, why would Ezra insist at this point in their Israel's history that they put away their foreign wives? George?
They weren't God approved.
Okay, why?
To me, I kind of maybe link it towards being unlawfully married in the sight of God.
Right, but why was God telling them not to be married?
Because of their influence that could take them away from serving God.
Exactly. Yeah. That was just one point I wanted at that time. But then you were speaking. Yeah, right. Okay. But we got to move on. This is a whole bit.
Well, it's the same in the New Testament when he says evil companions corrupt good morals, because they are evil by, in the sense of not being Jews, and they will corrupt that which is good.
Right. Right. Well, we might speak about that a little later on, but in the Old Testament, God commanded them not to do that, not to marry. The New Testament, that ban isn't on us, but we also have Paul warning us, and I think it's in Corinthians.
Depends how you interpret 1 Corinthians 7.
Yeah.
But I don't interpret it that way. But there are warnings upon warnings upon warnings
Right.
about marriage, and God's reasoning here wasn't that he didn't like those races as people.
No.
He didn't like that they didn't serve him. That was his reason. It wasn't God being racist. As we come along and say, oh, you can't marry that race. Well, why not? It's, okay, look who you're marrying. Marriage is important. Are they serving God? Because if they don't, you're going to have children. What about your children? What about you? I guess those are all things to consider.
Exactly, Jeremy. Yeah, speaking of the New Testament, God hasn't put the same type of ban, but we're warned of consequences. And we know, and I know personally, that when that mistake is made, it is usually the children that end up suffering. Because the children, in 90% of the situations, always follow the parent that is unfaithful. And you bear the consequences of that. But here, too, we got to remember, Israel had to be separated to God in all aspects of her life. She needed to be found in a proper relationship with God. And in those verses that Gordon College just read, well, from verse 6 down to verse 11, all those verses speak about a selection. And my thought was, who selected who between Israel and God? Did Israel select God, or did God select Israel? God chose Israel to be a possession for himself. He tells them that. And so because he chose them, then he has the right to direct them. And he wants them to stay pure. And the only way they would find peace and prosperity, we're told in those verses, is by being in God. And by marrying in other nations, then that relationship is severed. And the results could be worshiping other idols, other pagan gods.
Which is exactly what they were punished for in the first place. They were sent into captivity because they worshipped other gods. And they did, if we remember our study, they broke this rule that God had set from the beginning. They didn't clear the land of all the peoples, and so they married those peoples. And it was a plague throughout all of their history. And this wasn't to be. This is one of those cases where they were divorcing their wives. We would say, well, why would God allow it? But there was in this case, in this specific case, not one for us today, there was a principle that worshiping God was more important than being married. And if it was going to keep them from worshiping God, and it most certainly was, then it was better for them to worship God. It's a lesson for us that putting God first. Now, it's not an example we use to force our wives.
No.
But it is an example telling us God comes first. And we should consider God coming first.
Right. And when we don't, though, the consequences are there that we deal with later. And then, Jeff?
I always remember that, that this is God speaking of the nations and their ungodliness or idolatry, especially like we're saying. But I still remember there were Gentiles in the Old Testament who lived by faith, and some even in the lineage of Jesus. So, in case, again, like Jeremy pointed out, in case we think that God was a racist against other races, which he's not. Individuals, any individual had any opportunity to serve the true God and to do so. And there were. Amazingly, there were Gentiles who did.
Yeah.
Very few, but yeah.
Figure Rahab. You're right. There was, and it shows kind of, we say that we live under the age of grace. Well, God offered His grace to those back then too. But it's, as always, God knows best, and we see where He commanded His nation not to intermingle with them. And as Jeremy had pointed out, this was all before the captivity. That God had first gave these warnings in Deuteronomy. It's just interesting that after 70 years of captivity, of being without God, and now we see them falling back into the same sinful ways. And it's just a lesson for us, even as everyone has pointed out, how the constant need that we need of prayer and of reading the Word of God, reminding ourselves of so often the power of old sins that we can fall back into. And we'll see a little more of this.
You don't have the clicker up there someplace.
I'll do it. Well, I see. That's right. Sorry, I still have one more slide. And our last slide, then, finishing Ezra, of course, is the outline of what we just spent the last few Sundays on. The beginning of the book speaks of the first return of the captives under Zerubbabel, and then the restoration. Remember, Zerubbabel went back to restore worship and to build the temple in Jerusalem. And then in the second half of Ezra, we see now the story of Ezra and his return with his group of captives. And then the work of Ezra in Jerusalem when he went back, the teaching that he did. Of course, him being a priest. So whenever with Ezra, we just remember when you want to read about and study about the captivity and the return, that's where we can begin. Just remember Ezra and Zerubbabel, and it is in that book that we find that. I don't know if there are any more comments on that. We'll, if that's the case, then we'll move into Nehemiah.
One on the far left.
This one?
That one.
Yeah. I don't want to click on the wrong page here.
Yeah, please don't do that.
No. Or we'll be in big trouble. And so we open then this week with Nehemiah. We're going to look at we'll just get these notes aside. And Nehemiah then now is Nehemiah is the 16th book in the Old Testament. We've covered now 16 books of the Old Testament, beginning with creation. Now we're moving through the section in the that we call history, and it's the 11th. Nehemiah is the 11th book in the history section of Israel. And Nehemiah really continues the story now of the Jewish captives who were returning to Jerusalem from Babylonian captivity. Nehemiah 8 and verse 9. Let's remember that just to help us in our minds focus on the chronological order here, Nehemiah coexisted with Ezra. If you look at Nehemiah 8 verse 9, Lisa, do you want to read that, please? Ezra 9 or Ezra 8 verse 9? Or Nehemiah? Sorry. Okay, thank you. We'll look at this section a little later on in the question. But just the point that they worked together, Ezra and Nehemiah lived at the same time. And we see Nehemiah was the governor assigned by the Persian government. Nehemiah is governor over Judah. And Ezra, of course, is the priest and scribe. And the period that these two men belong to, and all of we've been studying in the last few weeks, is just the post-exile period, they call it, or the restoration period. And it was during this period that God's people returned to their homeland and rebuilt their temple under Zerubbabel. They reestablished their national religion in Jerusalem. And as we will see here in Nehemiah, Nehemiah rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem that were leveled by Nebuchadnezzar. And so then in our first section, in the origin of Nehemiah, we look at the title. And as with Ezra, ancient Jewish tradition regarded the books of Ezra and Nehemiah again as one volume. Modern scholars aren't sure on that view, so we continue to separate the two books. We have Ezra and we have Nehemiah. And our question one was, why is the book called Nehemiah? And what is the meaning of this name? Why do you think the book is called Nehemiah? Which good?
It's about Nehemiah.
Well, yeah, he's the main character, isn't he, in Nehemiah, same as Ezra. Nehemiah, what's the meaning of his name? Anybody come across that? We'll understand it more when we read more about Nehemiah.
God's comfort.
Yeah, the comfort of Jehovah, or God's comfort. That's right. And it's kind of when we study Nehemiah's character, that thought will come to our minds. But Nehemiah was the Jewish cupbearer of the Medo-Persian king Artaxerxes. In Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 1, we read that. And I won't read all our passages at the moment because we're going to double back on a lot of these. But we're told in Nehemiah 2 and verse 1 that Nehemiah was the cupbearer of the king. And this king, remember, was the same king who had commissioned Ezra to return to Jerusalem in Ezra 7 and 1. And now he's allowing Nehemiah to go back to Jerusalem to build its walls in 444 BC. And Nehemiah, just a little history with him. Nehemiah stays in Jerusalem for 12 years. Goes back, he stays there 12 years, and he returns to Persia in Artaxerxes' 32nd year of reign. And then around 425 BC, Nehemiah leaves Persia for the last time, and he returns to Jerusalem and he stays there. We hear no more till he dies. But Nehemiah leads the third party now of Jewish captives back to Jerusalem. And then, as we said, he serves as governor of Judah. That's his position. And he directs the people in the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem in chapters 3 and verse 7, or in chapter 7. But we're going to look at that a little later on. I've been trying, with this lesson, I'm trying not to double back over so many verses. But then the author of Nehemiah, we're asked here which two individuals are considered likely candidates to have authored the book, and which Igor? Okay, and which possibility makes the most sense in light of the evidences. There's two different views. Gord gave the two of them who authored the book. Ezra is one choice, and it's assumed that he wrote the book based upon the memoirs of Nehemiah himself. That's one view. And others say, according to Nehemiah 1:1, that Nehemiah wrote it. In the fact that, remember in Ezra, what did we say the book was written in? What grammatical?
First person.
Right, Jeremy, right. The first person. Nehemiah wrote it, and the fact that it is written in the first person, if we look at, Nehemiah 1 verses 1 to 2, look at verse 2, that Hanani, one of my brothers, and some men from Judah came, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped and had survived the captivity and about Jerusalem. That's Nehemiah and his brother in that verse. And so...
Well, it's kind of confusing, because when you say the words of, you're kind of assumes that you're repeating the words of somebody. So that kind of throws it off. Like the words of Jeremy, but I'm telling you the words of Jeremy. Jeremy told me. Jeremy said.
Right, but then Jeremy?
I was saying it could be someone compiled it and added a preface, or like sometimes we might say an introduction. These are the words, and then you deal with, okay, now this is a diary. It's sort of like if I write a book and someone writes an introductory paragraph or an introductory sentence, and then gives my words. It could have been done that way. It could have been Nehemiah saying, these are my words, only but because people don't know who he is, he spoke in the third person. That happens too, but...
That's right. But then in chapters 2 and verse 1, we have there, again, kind of the situation, and I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. Again, we see, that thought of the third person. Jeff?
Well, even if someone did write it other than Nehemiah, he'd just be a copyist. Because he would just be copying what Nehemiah had already written.
That's true.
Use the word Nehemiah already written. I'm going to write it again. So, either way.
Right. That's true, yeah, exactly. Well, my way of thinking is it's never been something that's caused a lot of stress, whether or not, because in lots of cases, the same as the dates, we really don't know exactly, do we? All we know for a fact is it's the Word of God, But those facts kind of favor Nehemiah as the author. And so whatever situation you choose, that's fine. Well, next we look at the date, and here again on our timeline, in 586, Judah is conquered by Babylon. The Babylonians destroy Jerusalem, and they carry off Judah into captivity. And then, as we saw in 539 now, Cyrus, the king of Persia, he conquers Babylon now, and he grants freedom to the Jews. And then in 538, this is the first return of the Jews to Jerusalem, being under the leadership of Zerubbabel here. And then 80 years later, in 458 BC, this is now the second movement of Jews, and this begins under the leadership of Ezra, of what we just studied. And within those preceding 80 years now, before Ezra left, the temple's been rebuilt in Jerusalem under Zerubbabel. And King Artaxerxes is now reigning in Persia. And then in 445 BC, this is the third group of Jews returning to Jerusalem, and under the direction now of Nehemiah. And then within this period of 443 to 433, the walls of Jerusalem now are rebuilt, and Nehemiah has come back to Persia, and then he returns back to Jerusalem, again leaving Persia for the last time. Sure?
Books we've studied so far, maybe the exception of Ruth, although it depends on how long you can get it. This is actually a short period of time.
Yes.
Genesis is such a long period of time. Exodus, a long period of time. This is a very short period of time that we're talking about.
Right.
And so that's just interesting to me.
It is. It is. Those of you that are quicker in math than me, you know, you just do the math there from 586 to Nehemiah's return. Yeah, it's not.
Yeah, well, I was just talking about that 445 to 433.
Yeah, that's true.
12
well,
years.
right.
12 years.
12 years. Yes. Yeah. We'll bring that up again. I don't want to jump ahead to that section.
I didn't know
but
you were going to.
we bring that thought up again. But that's a good point. It just helps us. Sometimes I'm not a big chronological studier because numbers confuse me. But if you spend a bit of time just looking at the numbers, it kind of helps you to understand how things are rolling along here. But then our book opened, whoops, where are we here? Our book opened with events taking place in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, who reigned from 464 to 424 BC. And then it closes with events which take place as late as the 32nd year of his reign. So then we say that likely the book was completed sometime between 432 and 425 BC. So it just, again, with all our timeline, just gives us an idea of how things are moving along here. So then our section under purpose in Nehemiah, we're asked the question in the historical section, we're asked the question, what vital historical information does the book of Nehemiah provide that is not provided elsewhere in the Old Testament? Remember, we had this question in Ezra. What was in Ezra that wasn't anywhere else? And I think we all kind of agreed that it was the rebuilding of the temple, the return to Jerusalem and the rebuilding. But Nehemiah, it provides us with the story of what? What story jumps to your mind, first of all, in Nehemiah? Right, Jeff, the rebuilding. Israel overcomes opposition, which we're going to look at later on, from her adversaries, and she rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem in only 52 days. If you look at Nehemiah 6, and verses 15 to 16, and we'll look at this again, so that's why I'm just kind of buzzing through quickly. We read there, so the wall was completed on the 25th of the month Elul in 52 days. When all our enemies heard of it, and all the nations surrounding us saw it, they lost their confidence, for they recognized that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. We'll look at that thought a little later on also. But that's the first story in Nehemiah that kind of always comes to the forefront. But the book also gives a record of the spiritual life of the restored nation being corrected through the reading of the law of Ezra. Lord gave us this thought a couple of weeks ago. Chapter 8 and verse 1 of Nehemiah, we read, here's a gathering that Nehemiah has formed, and all the people gathered as one man at the square, which is in front of the water gate, and they asked Ezra, the scribe, to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had given to Israel. And then again in chapter 9 and verse 38, now because of all this, we are making an agreement in writing, and on the sealed document are the names of our leaders, our Levites, and our priests. That was the end result of that, which we'll look at a little later on. And we read in chapter 13 of the reforms that Nehemiah brought about. And it's also interesting to note that the work of Nehemiah in Jerusalem, as was with Ezra, was fully sanctioned by the Medo-Persian king Artaxerxes. Whatever Nehemiah needed, wanted, that Gentile king helped him. It gave him what he needed to do, whatever he asked of it. And this might bring to mind, well, I just said it, another situation involving a recent Persian king. What was the king that granted Ezra the rights to go back? Who was that? Yeah. I thought of that when I was thinking of Artaxerxes. Cyrus also helped out, aided. Of course, we see God's hand in that, but also, like I said, it speaks of these kings' characters. They certainly weren't like Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't have let them go. He brought them there. He destroyed their city and their walls. But speaking of Nehemiah and God, in the doctrinal section, we're asked the question, how does Nehemiah demonstrate God's ability to provide for his people? We've got 5 minutes. We have enough time. I just had one reading here. I thought it'd be good to get us all to read a little bit here. We've got 20 verses I picked. Maybe if we speak clearly and read out, let's read beginning at Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 1. And concentrate on what we're reading here and what Nehemiah, a bit about his character. It just speaks of his character, and I think it's good for us to be impressed with this. But we'll read Nehemiah 1, and we'll go to chapter 2 and verse 9. So we'll read 3 verses each. I'll begin, and then I'll move to Jeremy, and we'll go that way. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month Chislev in the 20th year, while I was in Susa, the capital, that Hanani, one of my brothers, and some men from Judah came. And I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped and had survived the captivity, and about Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach, and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are burned with fire.
It came to pass, when I heard these words, that I sat down and wept and mourned certain days, and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven, and said, I beseech thee, O Lord God of heaven, the great and terrible God, that keeps covenant and mercy for them that love him, and observe his commandments. Let your ear now be attentive, and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before thee now, day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you, both I and my father's house have sinned.
We have acted very corruptly against you, and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though you disperse the under the farthest skies, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place that I have chosen, to make my name dwell there.
They are your servants and your people whom you redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, I beseech you, may your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and the prayer of your servants who delight to rever your name, and make your servant successful today, and grant him compassion before this man. Now I was the cupbearer to the king.
Lisa, first two verses in chapter 2.
And it came to pass in the month of Ezra, in the 12th year of King Ezra, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I get nevertheless, said in the presence of God. Therefore the king said to me, why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart. So I became dreadfully afraid.
John? No? Or Henry, do you want to read verses 3 and 4?
And I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why shall my face now be sad, when the city faced by palace ruins, and its streets and its gates burned with fire? Then the king said to me, what do you request? So I prayed to the God of heaven.
Cherry, 2 verses? Annie, 2 verses? Please.
Then I said to the king, this is the king, as let us to be given into the governors of the province beyond the river, that he may grant me passage and Judah, for I am Judah, and for thy country for the people of the forest, erecting and condemning, and will be for the gate of the temple,
gonna have to end, I guess, the second bell is, I know now how frustrating it gets for Jeremy. Right. We'll look at this, next week, I'll just buzz over that reading, sum it up for you, because we need to just consider some things of Nehemiah there that are good for us. So we'll end with our class there.